Greetings. I am Jeremy Spoon, the Director of the Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program here at Portland State University. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Portland State is located in the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and other indigenous peoples of the river known as Wimal, Nichiwana, and Columbia. We are grateful to be guests on these lands. Acknowledging territory shows recognition of and respect for indigenous peoples, both past and present. Recognition and respect are essential elements of establishing healthy reciprocal relationships and developing a sense of place. This is a critical time to emphasize that humans and the environment are inextricably connected, especially during the global COVID-19 pandemic and while wildfires, landslides, and floods threaten health and safety here in Portland and across the US West. Indigenous relationships with their ancestral lands can help folks recognize how humans and the environment are one. Let us work together to honor their lives and ancestors, their descendants, and our own heritage. Thank you. Welcome to part 5 of the Toward Resilient Futures speaker series. This monthly speaker series presents cutting-edge research and approaches on the resilience of urban and rural communities and systems to hazards and disasters. We've been featuring the faculty of our new Emergency Management and Community Resilience graduate program at Portland State University through this series. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce you a little bit to what the EMCR program is all about. I'd also like to say that this talk is brought to you by the Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience, ICDR, through the Center for Public Service, which will be introduced at the end of the talk today. The Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program at Portland State University is a response to this timely moment while we're going through a global pandemic, while we have annual fire seasons with increasing frequency, and that we all know that in the background, there may be a seismic event in our future. This program aims to train the workforce that's emerging at the interface of community and hazards. Our goal is to train the next generation of practitioners in the skills that they need to get jobs in this emerging field, both locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Our program addresses multiple aspects of how hazards and disasters function, such as what we call the disaster resilience cycle here. Our program engages preparation, relief, both short and long-term recovery and mitigation, and tries to think about solutions to innovate these timely events and actions in order to make them more equitable, more aware, and especially in conversation with the moment that we're in, as we're increasing our knowledge of the hazards and disasters that are around us, as well as our knowledge of systemic issues of inequality within our societies, and that how we can think about those being replicated in the future and whether or not root causes are being addressed through some of the solutions that are proposed. This program aims to teach students skills. It brings together faculty from 6 different fields: anthropology, geography, geology, public administration, urban studies and planning, and communication, to create a core curriculum to provide students with a thematic education with some of the best graduate courses from research active faculty that work locally and globally across the world. In addition, we have components where we want to bring in communities, such as this speaker series, where we infuse the professional realm of emergency management into the space where our students are learning and grappling with what steps they want to take forward. We also want to serve as a resource for the community to enhance skills on emergency management, response, mitigation, preparation, and all the different stages of the disaster resilience cycle we discussed. We're offering a master's degree starting this fall. This master's degree is unrolled in 4 different parts. It has a core curriculum of 9 classes from the 6 disciplines that I mentioned, and then also has a flexible methods and field specialization component with more than 100 different electives at the graduate level to cater your education to a particular pathway, job, hazard, interest area. In addition, we have capstones that are woven into our program with community partners, where our program has the opportunity to also provide and feed back in the community with value-added assets through our students while providing career training for the future. Our faculty, which are being showcased in this speaker series, conduct research globally and locally, and we try and take our transdisciplinary lessons learned and apply them to pragmatic solutions through our research, through our teaching, and through the actions and experiences that we provide for our students. So for those that are interested in a career in public service, we offer what is one of the only degrees in the US that connects emergency management to community resilience. We also offer a graduate certificate, which is a ladder to the master's degree, but is also a wonderful form of professional training for folks that would like to move forward in this field and like some more formalized education, but don't have the opportunity for a full master's program. We also offer a non-credit, non-degree professional certificate, which is going on right now, which has 8 modules that occur over an 8-week period, 4 hours apiece, which give you a taste of some of the best elements of our program and our curriculum, but in accessible aspects that you can take with you without a rigorous assessment at the end, but rather it be for enrichment and learning, for lifelong learning and skill building. So please think about our programs. We have our application open until May 31st of this year, and then we'll have admissions annually at that same time each year. We will have this speaker series ongoing. It will be monthly, and after we feature all of our faculty, which is what we're doing now, it will shift to a practitioner-based speaker series where folks will learn from the trenches what is going on from different aspects of emergency management and disaster risk reduction, and hope to have a space where our students can create a network, as well as our partners create additional relationships and a network that we can build on and be a hub for that in the community. All of the talks in our speaker series, again, this is part 5 of 7, are posted at the link below. And also you'll get an email that will give you a notice when this one is up and linked. So feel free to check out some of our other talks. And we have 2 additional talks coming in the months to come. And we look forward to moving forward together with community in these difficult times, and have Portland State be a vanguard in this by starting this program and creating a space for community to learn and grow and start creating a new workforce to engage these ever-increasing global problems. Today, it is my absolute pleasure to bring Vivek Shandas to us today from Portland State University. He's a professor in the School of Urban Studies and Planning and the founding director of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at Portland State University. He's also chair of the Urban Forestry Commission for the City of Portland. Professor Shandas studies the effects of urban development patterns and processes on ecosystems and social justice. By examining the assumptions about our built environment, Professor Shandas centers historically marginalized communities in assessing adaptation strategies from climate-induced stressors such as urban heat, air quality, and pluvial funding. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Shandas today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's nice to be here with you all. I have a set of slides here that I'd love to share with you about work we've been engaging in around the concept of resilience, and in this case, specifically thinking about resilience in relation to the urban forest. If you walk around the Portland metro region, where several of us live, you might notice a pretty verdant, abundant tree canopy around the region, and surveys suggest that communities really admire and appreciate this rich urban forest we have in and around the region. And it really is something that often draws people to Portland and the metro region as something that really provides both recreational opportunities, everyday solace, as well as ways for us to kind of recuperate, particularly during the pandemic, where we've been seeing a lot of evidence that communities are relying on the urban forest for their own resilience. And so it's a really timely topic for us to be chatting about, and something we've been spending a lot of time with folks trying to understand some of the practices, pitfalls, and promises for creating a resilient forest that so many of us appreciate and admire during these difficult times where we're often isolated and having challenges with being able to get out and about. I want to share with you a little bit of the work that a collective, that a group of us that we're essentially calling ourselves a Smart Trees collective here in the Portland metro region with Reed College, Washington State University, Vancouver, as well as PSU, are collaboratively trying to understand aspects of this resilient forest. So this, while I'm coming to you on this particular speaker series, this is a collective effort that is several graduate students, undergrads, professors, researchers, postdocs, et cetera, that are contributing to the work that I'll be presenting today. So I am going to try to do my best to reflect this very broad set of work that is happening right now. Before I get into that, though, let me just tell you a little bit about me and how maybe I got into this, and in my reflections of work that's happening in and around the region. I have tended to look at communities from space. That's what my training has been in. I've often spent a lot of time looking at satellite imagery, looking at airborne images. And, you know, I was reflecting on kind of one of the first places that I saw imagery like this as an adult. And it really was where I went to school as an undergrad, was UC Santa Cruz, UCSC, not to be confused with Uncle Charlie's summer camp, which it often felt like, because you were in a environment where the buildings were far fewer than the trees. And you would see a lot of trees when you look at this, for example, this particular image of UC Santa Cruz campus, where the buildings are hidden amongst the trees. And it was one of my first experiences as an adult to really encounter some of the different ways in which we can build our cities, that we can think about the interspersing of buildings and trees, and trying to understand that our cities are part of a broader landscape. And in this case, in the Portland landscape, or even in the Santa Cruz landscape here, that these human dominated landscapes are essentially on top of what used to be large old growth forests, which are on the landscapes that indigenous communities long inhabited. And so part of this really for us comes into trying to understand how landscapes and human communities interact to create resilience, and how is that co-produced? And I'll come back to that co-production idea later, though wanted to just give you a little sense of at least my first early introduction into trying to understand our urban spaces and how we go about creating these environments that could amplify some of the impacts on our leafy friends, or could in some ways mediate or even reduce harm on these trees and urban forests. So that's kind of at the core of what I'll be essentially talking to you about today. And I want to start, though, on a similar note, looking at landscapes, different set of landscapes. And this is much more of an urbanized landscape, something you might be familiar with. I'm sure many of you have seen images like this, where we're getting with drones a lot more specific descriptions, a lot more detailed, highly detailed, resolved imagery like this, where you see a road on the right side of the screen that has a sidewalk, some cars that park, some single family residential homes. And what's interesting about this is there are really no trees in the private right of way alongside that little green strip you might notice between the road and the sidewalk. That is very precious real estate in cities when we're talking about trees. That little strip for most households is about the extent to which we could actually think about an urban tree. And that's about all we're working with. And keep in mind that little tiny strip is often is connected to underground pipes, has overhead power lines, has a bunch of other infrastructure that trees are actively competing against. And I'll come back to that as well. Though if you look at that street on the left, you might not even be able to see a street because of the rich tree canopy that's represented there. And just putting those two together for me really brings out an understanding of the distributional effects of tree canopy in our urban environments, and that some areas would have very few, if any, on the public right of way, and others would be just very rich, very full canopy. And so this is what I have been observing in and around Portland. And it turns out when we look across the country, we see very similar patterns as well. We see that some neighborhoods, while they may have a lot of canopy on one street and very little on another, some neighborhoods are completely devoid of canopy and may have a handful of trees that we can even identify. And those trees that may be there may not be living as well. And so we're really thinking about part of the built environment as the urban forest. And there's entire careers that are created around urban forestry. There's an entire series of conferences and journals that focus on this. So it's an entire field in and of itself. And I'm not going to do justice to the entire field in the short time I have with you all today, but I do want to share a little bit of what we've been looking at, what we've been observing when we look at these landscapes. And I want to start really with this idea of our everyday experience, going from space to the ground. And this really is about trying to understand, why do we have the specific experiences we do when we leave our homes, when we leave our workplaces, when we go out and about in our neighborhoods. Often these neighborhoods are a mix of buildings, infrastructure, roadways, sidewalks, and various other facilities. And sometimes, as the image on the right might suggest, they're also filled with these trees. You might notice this set of trees on the right image and really lacking trees, at least in the near image here on the left side, many trees, some small shrubs on the ground. There's even a little patch on the ground where a tree could go, but there's no tree there. So these everyday experiences are often mediate things that affect our health and well-being as well. These are things such as the air we breathe, the temperature we experience, particularly on hot days when a shade of a tree could be a difference of about 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we are actively being affected by, and as a result, affect the landscapes that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And so the role that trees play is not trivial in that. And that's the big argument I want to make with you today, is that the ability to just get a tree into the ground is far more complicated and far more challenging than you might imagine. And I want to at least share a little bit of a few of the insights that we've been learning about why that's the case. When we look around the country, this particular effect of having trees is really going to be amplified in this era of what we're calling the Anthropocene, where humans have had a profound effect on the planet as a whole, and as a result, the planet as a whole is affecting us. And that really comes out in more common language in the era of climate change, where we're seeing massive shifts in the extreme events, such as days above 90 degrees, where, for example, Phoenix last year hit an all-time record on days above 100. And where the climate models would suggest that we are also in the Pacific Northwest going to see far hotter temperatures, as has already started trending up, at least as the empirical data would suggest. So not only are we seeing hotter summers, we're also seeing wetter winters in these phenomena such as atmospheric rivers that can really channel a tremendous amount of moisture in a very narrow band of clouds that will drop large amounts of a deluge of water that can often overwhelm sewer systems and can really affect the infrastructure, underground infrastructure, pipes and what have you, in terms of being able to convey that water. So trees really could potentially play a very important role as frontline mitigative actors in this era of climate change. And whether it be the shade they provide or the ability to absorb rainwater as it falls from the sky, these are the kinds of what we call ecosystem services that several of us have been studying for some time. And as we think about climate change, and then we think about what are the other factors that might really complicate and challenge us in terms of getting green spaces into the ground, there's another major issue that's less on a planetary scale and much more on a provincial scale, which has to do with where the trees exist. And when we think about the journal articles that are coming out, the front page news on this topic, we're often finding that the distribution of tree canopy is not really equitable across urban landscapes. Some areas, some neighborhoods have systematically more tree canopy than others. And we've been scratching our heads for a long time and asking kind of, why is that the effect? Why is that really happening? And for a long time, this had to do, the scholars I was talking to would say this is the luxury effect, where the richer communities have money to be able to hire landscapers to come in and curate their land, their lawns, their backyards, and plant trees and prune them and take care of them. And that's why we're seeing more trees in richer, often whiter communities than we're seeing in lower income communities of color. And so we're seeing this distributional justice play out in terms of these leafy friends of ours across our urban landscapes. And this is becoming far more of a science now as we're starting to systematically assess spatial distribution and understanding what are the potential implications for some of this work. And when the luxury hypothesis that people who have more money are seeing more trees emerged, there was something very unsatisfying and in fact unsatisfactory about it for me. And it seemed like there was a bigger play at work here. And so a few of us started looking at what might be other reasons, more systemic reasons why we're seeing this inequitable distribution of our tree canopy. And I really want to start here to talk about resilience, in part, resilient urban forest, in part because this next slide really, or this next set of studies really underscore much of what we know of in terms of the distribution of canopy today. And it has to do with some federal planning decisions that were made back right after the Great Depression of 1929. Just to venture into history for 1 minute here, so that I can contextualize some of the reasons we're seeing tree canopy and the challenges to certain species of tree in cities, is partly having to do with the fact that, at the local level, there was a number of race-based policies that allowed certain communities access to certain neighborhoods. At the federal level, there was Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the New Deal era, during the 1930s, just as he was elected as president, he was coming in with a bunch of policies, all of them Congress, unlike today, we're just passing them left and right. And one of those was the creation of an organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which essentially allowed for access to mortgages or specifically refinancing homes so that communities could essentially not default on the loans that they had to the banks. And this was, of course, a concern about big defaults, further spiraling the economy into deeper recession. And so the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, came in as a way to be able to bolster some of the opportunities for communities to access capital so that they can pay their mortgages and enable to stay in their homes. Unfortunately, this was being developed right during a time when there was a number of different factors of risk that were being developed. And risk in this case, from a bank's point of view, and specifically the Homeowners Loan Corporation point of view, was based on the color of one's skin. And that's where it got really pernicious, in the sense that we created what were these redlining maps for every city in the country, where red areas that were marked in red, like these maps you see here, were essentially places where low-income communities, communities of color, particularly African Americans who were targeted by many of these particular policies, were living. And those areas did not have access. People living in those areas didn't have access to these mortgages. And so what we start seeing is this really vicious cycle start to play out from federal planning decisions that took place in the 1930s and then were eliminated through the Fair Housing Act of 1968 and all through the Civil Rights era of the 1960s. Yet this decade of these particular racial-based segregation policies that played out at the local level was our hunch that this may have had something to do with why we're seeing trees in the places we're seeing them today. And when we looked at 108 cities across the country, here's what we found. We found, regardless of whether you're at the national level, Midwest, Northeast, West, or South, that areas that were demarcated in red, they were considered the D category. There was an A, B, C, D category. A was considered, quote, the best areas, often where wealthy white communities live. B was considered still desirable. C was considered definitely declining. That's the yellow bar graph you see here. And D was considered hazardous in terms of risk and mortgages. And so what we're seeing is tree canopy in these 108 cities, regardless of where you lived, was consistently lower in the D graded areas than the A graded areas. And then if we go in a little bit further and look to see what was actually on the landscape, we can find that these D graded areas had a lot more concrete and asphalt, what we generally call impervious surface, than the A graded areas. In fact, across the country, A graded areas tended to look more like my UC Santa Cruz experience than my current day Portland experience, when in fact there was more green spaces on average in these A graded areas than there were impervious surface. And that was really startling to us. And so we started scratching the surface a little bit further and learning that, when the Federal Highway Administration went forward with a number of, in the 1950s, with a bunch of freeways, and there was industrial plants being cited, that the areas that were the lowest land rent, this is an urban economics question, the lowest land rent areas were those that received those massive asphalt pavement projects, like what you would imagine with a manufacturing plant or an industrial plant or a major Federal Highway Administration program. And so the neighborhoods that were often affected by these particular policies were those D and C areas, which we have also seen across the country. And large-scale big box stores, housing projects were all part of it. What was interesting is that since they were disinvested for those set of decades, they were further disinvested. And as we'll talk about in a minute, it was much harder to get green spaces into those areas due to a variety of reasons, which I'll talk about in a second here. So interesting to us, since I'm presenting to a Portland audience, largely, I imagine here, Portland metro region, is the temperature difference. So this is what trees really help to mediate, is the temperature difference between those D areas, so those, quote, hazardous areas, and those A areas, quote, the best areas from the Hulk perspective, that Portland was actually the highest difference between the redlined areas and their non-redlined counterparts compared to all 108 other cities that we looked at. So that to us was a really startling moment of reckoning, where we were seeing that, places in Alberta, Old Town, Chinatown, Mississippi, Albina, these redlined areas of Portland were on average much hotter today than areas like Irvington or Eastmoreland, west of the Willamette and so forth. So part of what that ended up suggesting to us is that Portland, Denver, Minneapolis, these cities that were often not kind of the poster child for redlining policies were yet also very affected by these policies as well. And needless to say, when we think about this more broadly, and this was a paper that came out from a colleague, Chris Schell, who was at Tacoma, who'll be at Berkeley next year, and his colleagues came out with, where they were essentially suggesting that this residential segregation policies is much of the reason that we're seeing the current distribution of tree canopy. And this came out shortly after our study, and in a much more graphically interesting format, I might add. And where they went even further is they were able to kind of connect the environmental justice movements with social justice movements to kind of talk about how these systemic biases that we have within our institutions create these racist policies that direct resources like green spaces, like mortgages, and building wealth in communities in specific spatially discernible ways that then get translated into a series of ecological and environmental implications, ultimately leading to effects on our urban ecology. And so while this work was happening, we were continuing to ask the question, okay, so how do we understand the resilience of the forest? And that's where this background and this kind of context might help you get a better sense, or may even contextualize some of where we're going with this work today. So where are we going? Well, since the ending of the policies, the redlining policies in 1968, we would have assumed that there was a greater recognition that these areas that were disinvested, the C and D areas, would have gotten more tree canopy, would have gotten some more investments, would have gotten parks, would have gotten other things that were left out of those decades of disinvestment. Though when we look from 1984 to 2019 of how much green spaces do cities around the country have from 1984 to 2019, what we see is what we're working on is this idea of a center score that's essentially saying how much green space are there in communities that were historically disinvested well past the redlining era. And what we're noticing is that Philadelphia, for example, and Los Angeles has gotten only more inequitable over time. In fact, they've gotten a larger proportion of trees going into the A and B areas than they have in the C and D areas. And that if we look at this a little bit more closely at Portland, we see, for example, in Portland, from the 1980s to 2004, we see a much more trees and greening happening in the historically well-off areas and much less in the disinvested areas. Though after 2004, we see greater interest in greening of areas that were historically redlined. And so what we're trying to get at here is that these particular policies that were in place with redlining are still playing out today, not only in terms of current day tree distribution, though also in the policies that are in place for distributing trees in and around metro region. And so we're digging into this, and I have a paper that will be coming out hopefully soon on this particular concept of a neighborhood tree equity ratio that allows us to kind of monitor cities over time to see how well they're doing in terms of tree canopy and how well it's changing. This is to be combined now with other changes that are happening in the neighborhood. One thing we're also noticing when it comes to trees is that when we look at cities across the country, we're seeing this kind of notion of a green squeeze, where if we just look at population change in the A, B, C, and D areas, trees are really challenged in the C and D areas, in part because there's so much growth. Like, think about a lot of housing projects in the Portland region. Many of those are going in the historically C and D areas, which further covers the landscape with asphalt and concrete, thereby reducing available spaces for getting trees into the ground. You might notice if you're walking around Portland these days, how developers are building from the edge of a lot to the edge of a lot, which allows for very little accessibility of private green space, which is by and large the largest places where trees exist in the city. And yet we're finding greater and greater population growth, and whether it be Oakland or whether it be Los Angeles or whether it be Berkeley, Sacramento, and certainly Portland, the C and D areas are gaining the largest population growth over the last 40-ish years, 35, 36 years. And this is not a surprise to many of us. We're wondering whether this is the notion of a permissive space where communities that have often said, not in my backyard, are continuing to say, we don't want that housing project, we don't want that development to happen in our backyard, we want it to go to another neighborhood. So what we're seeing is communities pushing these developments off into other neighborhoods. And if you're paying close attention, these are actually percentages on the y-axis here, not 0.2%, not 0.2%. They're actually, for example, in Portland, almost 20% of the population growth in this case happened in the C, in the historically C area of the city from 1980 to 2016. We're going to be updating this with 2020 census data and see if that's continuing over the last 4 years as well. So again, trees, I want to kind of step back from this and say, not only do we have historic kind of sealing up of surfaces and harder to get trees into the ground, so therefore a person who's working for a city who really wants to get tree into historically disinvested areas is going to be extra challenged because the cost of cutting out areas for getting that tree in ends up being cost prohibitive, and it's hard to make a case that that would be preferable to an area where you can just dig a hole and put a tree in, likely in the A or B areas. So where does this leave us today? Well, we're embarking on something of a pretty ambitious project where we're really trying to understand the resilience of the urban forest, understand the resilience of the urban forest given all the pressures on it right now. And we're seeing urban trees as a proxy for climate change, in that we can actually assess not only how higher temperatures are affecting the trees, we can also start to see how greater frequency of heat waves and greater rain events and higher ozone events might be affecting the health and well-being of our leafy friends. And so part of what we're trying to do is use cities and use our neighborhoods as almost as a laboratory for understanding how the stresses trees are experiencing are either supporting their health or diminishing their health. And that's really where some of this work is headed. For example, Aaron Ramirez, Hannah Pranther, and others at Reed College are working on questions of tree health by looking at the amount of water that moves up a tree stem. So they're actually trying to understand the vulnerability, or the other side of the coin, if you will, the resilience of a tree of three different tree species: Douglas fir, common in the region, western red cedar, and big leaf maple, in terms of how well is water moving up the column and into the leaves so that it can be a healthy tree. What we're starting to see in some of these findings, when they're going up and getting tree branches and doing the assessments, we've already observed various tree dieback in even parks like Lentz Park here in the image, where we're seeing some cedars really starting to dry out. And we're seeing this on a massive scale around California. So it's giving us some indication that this may be a phenomenon that's affecting the resiliency of trees. So there's students and staff and researchers going up into tree canopies, collecting branches, being able to do assessments on those. We're using imagery, various infrared imagery, to see how hot various canopies might be. And then we're also doing lab studies to try to understand distribution of the movement of water. In this case, the measure is conductivity. I don't want to get into the mechanics of the technical aspects of this, though happy to if you so wish in the question discussion time. But we're looking at, for example, Douglas fir, western red cedar, and big leaf maple, and noticing that in the warmer areas where there's a tree, there's much greater loss in the tree's ability to move water up the column than in the cooler areas, than in these control sites. So that's really telling us a little bit about different species having different vulnerabilities to increasing temperatures. And that may lead to ways to be able to improve the resiliency through, of course, things like maintenance and watering and various other pruning and other strategies we could take. But first, we need to document whether this is really a phenomenon, and that's where this work is going. And I want to kind of come around and not take too much more time, so I could leave some time for discussion here, is images that I got from our team here, about what's being set up on some of these trees. We're looking at rural landscapes out in the Sandy. We're looking at urban landscapes at Reed College as well as downtown. And we're selecting a series of other sites this summer to go out and actually do this monitoring to understand what's happening with the growth of trees and whether the stress that a tree experiences would affect its growth as well. And of course, folks, Kevin Moffitt's lab at Washington State University in Vancouver, as well as Andre Holtz's lab, lots of different kinds of strategies that are being deployed to understand kind of what the inside of a tree, what's happening on the inside of a tree during these stresses. Trees are remarkably kind of poised and gracious in their physical, in how you see them. You might not even notice that a tree is undergoing massive stress. And so these mildly invasive strategies can allow us to tap into, literally and figuratively, a little bit of the health conditions of the individual trees, and then starting to think about that on a region-wide level. Simultaneous to these ground-based measurements, we're also, as I mentioned, looking at the trees in the region from airborne imagery. So we're looking at data sets from things like LIDAR. You've maybe heard of radar, which is radio frequency. This is light frequency. And so we're able to look at different wavelengths of light and start describing not only where the trees are, how much biomass they have, but we're also starting to assess using these airborne imagery, the health of the trees based on various really minute changes in color that we might be seeing in the needles or leaves. So it's an extraordinarily ambitious process to try to understand the resiliency of the urban forest, though through the ground-based measurements, through understanding kind of the forest as a whole, as well as understanding some of the policies that have led to this distributional effect, we're starting to get a better grasp on why and how these particular green leafy friends of ours might be really struggling to stay alive in some of these very hot and increasingly inhospitable landscapes that we're putting them in. And so with that, I just want to end with two kind of provocations about what we're trying to move towards. We really need to recognize that the systems that created these inequities have not changed since the inception of redlining policies. We're still essentially coming to the same conclusions about if trees are an indicator. We're coming to the same conclusions, and we really need to kind of build greater evidence around these inequities to understand what might be effective policies and how to change existing policies to address those challenges. And then, of course, just planting trees in neighborhoods can further amplify inequities. We really need to create these community-based organizations approach to co-produce landscapes collaboratively. I really want to kind of touch on that, because this isn't some communities have had things done unto them, especially disinvested communities, for generations. And if we're just going in with trees and saying, yes, here's something good for you, communities are already very reticent to be able to engage in those kinds of conversations because of the mistrust and economic insecurities that might then make it challenging for a tree to actually survive in those environments. So just want to leave you with those and my contact information. Glad to think about some questions and have a discussion to get a little deeper into what might be ways to think through some of these challenges that we're seeing with the resiliency of the urban forest. I'll stop sharing here and turn it back over to Masami.
All right. Well, thank you, Vivek. It was a very intriguing presentation. For those of you who doesn't know me, I am Masami Nishishiba, professor and chair of the Department of Public Administration at PSU. I am also a co-director and co-founder of the Initiatives for Community and Disaster Resilience, ICDR. ICDR is co-organizing today's event and also other speaker series with the EMCR programs. Professor Hiro Ito, chair of the Department of Economics, and myself have founded ICDR in 2017. Our mission is to provide a forum where experts from the academia, the governmental sector, and non-profit or for-profit organizations can exchange information on and discuss emergency management, disaster preparedness, and other resilience-related topics. Since its creation, ICDR has focused on two activities. First is this lecture series, and then the second is to organize the field trip course at PSU. The highlight of this course is to go to the Tohoku area in Japan, where a 9.1 magnitude earthquake and massive tsunami hit on March 11, 2011. All right, so that's enough for an advertisement of my organization. Let's go back to Vivek. We have numbers of questions posted on the Q&A. So I will read the question and ask Vivek to answer them. So the first question, does Portland have an urban forest succession plan for the ruling transition of older, larger street trees that wouldn't be allowed now, like requirement for replanting, small ornamental trees instead of replacing the elms lost to disease. Is that?
Yeah, a formal succession plan, I don't know about. I don't think there's a formal succession plan as we would think about, for example, an urban forest management plan, something along those lines. Our urban forest management plan is from 2004 in the city of Portland. So it's just after Y2K, and it's probably was being developed during Y2K, for those of you who can remember that particular period. It's pretty outdated. It doesn't really get into a lot of the questions of a lot of the data sets, as well as questions of equitable distribution that we really have been spending a lot of time thinking about. So there's no real succession plan per se. What we're really thinking about is how to think about the distributional inequities right now. And that's why I keep coming back to that. That's been largely informing kind of where are the trees now? How do we think about expanding that canopy so that neighborhoods can reach that threshold of getting to what we're really trying to push for is 40 or greater percentage, but really the urban forest management plan is much more in the 30s, in the low 30s, as the amount of percentage of canopy in the neighborhood. So yeah, it's a succession plan, not necessarily in place. And so when you see a Dutch elm disease taking out an elm tree, for example, it's not necessarily that that plant tree is going to have, that area is going to have consideration for being replanted. It's much more a limited set of resources. And what we're trying to say is a lot of those resources have gone to supporting and maintaining the existing tree canopy in highly canopied neighborhoods for a long time. How do communities that haven't had that resource investment also participate in that conversation as well? So that's another very different way of thinking about succession in this case.
Thank you. The next question. In Portland suburbs, particularly in newer areas that were never subject to redlining, Metro's urban growth boundary and density guidelines push trees into riparian corridor alone, which don't mitigate urban heat islands fully. Now, residents are nervous about increased wildfire risk as well. Are you able to work through some of the policy entities such as Metro, GLCB, FEMA, OVF, and the development community to develop strategies to cost effectively promote greater tree canopy preservation or re-establishment? Also, are you going to redo your urban cloud mapping from the 2040 LIDAR with the 2019-2020 Metro GIG LIDAR?
Okay, thanks, Masami. So the easy answer first, yes, we're redoing the 2014 tree crown delineation, and I have a postdoc working on that right now. In fact, I'm walking over to PGE has been a partner on it, Portland General Electric, and they've given us about $1 million worth of data. So it's an incredible data set that they're providing us for both LIDAR and, as I was saying, the colors. We can get at kind of species and potential health of species based on this data set called a hyperspectral data set that we're going to be also looking at from the 2019 LIDAR and hyperspectral flight that PGE commissioned. So that's definitely happening. We've been waiting almost 1.5 years for that with bated breath to make that happen. So I'm literally going to walk over and pick up the 15 terabytes of data on Tuesday, which we've been very excited about. So yes, that's happening. The harder question, though, that Anne presents here is one about kind of thinking about working through some of the policy entities. And it's interesting, you know, often what I've found is that trees are even working within the city context, trees are one of the last things that are brought into the conversation. And we're really trying to change that dynamic because trees, as we know, for a variety of reasons, play a very instrumental role in our landscape. And it's been really hard to have the conversation about trees because they're considered often a luxury entity, and saying that, you know, affordable housing doesn't need trees, commercial industrial entities don't need trees. They're only in these specific single family large lot neighborhoods. And there are a number of policy bottlenecks that prevent us from really thinking about trees in spaces where they haven't existed before. And so absolutely working with policy entities to try to develop strategies to promote greater tree canopy preservation. I'll be presenting to DLCD actually tonight on this exact topic and how do we think about trees. And it's interesting from an academic point of view, the framing of trees is really, we're really thinking about it from a point of view of green infrastructure, because if they are providing services and we are understanding ecosystem services as a relevant and important part of our human health and well-being, then ecosystem services and green infrastructure becomes a frame around which we think about what does it mean to have more infrastructure investment in one place versus not in another place, and how do we maintain those tree canopy, which in the city of Portland, as you know, it's the adjacent property owners that take care of trees, which I have a tremendous amount of privilege because I can pay the arborist to come in and, you know, charge $200, sometimes $500 to prune the trees in my yard, but that's not something that's relatively easy to do for a lot of communities. So that's somewhat of a challenge. Yes, so reestablishment as well, preservation and reestablishment. Heritage tree is one way we do it in the city, but outside Portland, there's so many different. Washington County has a parks district, which has some policies to be able to enable tree canopy preservation or reestablishment, but it is really a local, very local, hyper local decision that's often made for addressing that.
Thank you. Here's another policy-related question. What do you think about property tax policies to reward property owners who maintain healthy trees for the external benefits that they represent to the wider community? In other words, would incentives be more effective than regulations?
Yeah, it's interesting. We found, I mean, the evidence on this is really interesting, and I imagine Bureau of Environmental Services would be a great person to respond to this, in part because we have seen incentives like the tree bait program, which provides a rebate on having trees in your private property to reduce the demand on the stormwater systems around your property. And so that tree bait program has been really quite emblematic of a lot of incentive type programs that have helped property owners maintain their tree canopy. And so that's a start. We can certainly think about more incentives there, and whether the extent to which whether the tree bait program has actually been more effective than regulatory policies. I haven't seen any evidence going either way on that. So I think there's still some research to be done on the relationship between things like the incentives and regulations. What we're seeing is that trees are coming down incredibly fast in the city. We've actually seen, after this 2019 LIDAR assessment, I think we're going to see a net reduction in trees from 2014 to 2019, even though the city promulgated a official tree code, Title 11, in 2015, January 1st, 2015. So during that time period, what this perspective is going to do for this region is from 2015 to 2020, we're going to see whether there's actually been an increase, decrease in tree canopy. And we have ongoing hunches as to what that might be. But to get that question, we're still really looking at the evidence for that. And I mean, I can speculate that it's going to take a pretty hefty dose of both in order to have preserve the tree canopy in the city.
Thank you. If we plant trees in disadvantaged communities, then we gentrify and raise home prices and move people to lower economic areas. How do we solve this?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. This is something we're seeing happen. You know, it's interesting. There's a recent study that came out that did not show. This is a question that comes up almost every time I present on trees. And I've been watching the studies come out on this. And a recent study, which I have to dig up, but a recent study I recall reading had a result that essentially showed very little effect of tree planting. In fact, we saw it's about like, what is it that amplifies gentrification? And what they were able to document is that the trees had a very minor marginal effect on gentrification, if at all. And so there's that evidence that I'm tracking. And again, it wasn't done here in Portland metro region. Nevertheless, the idea that bringing in green spaces displaces communities is, I think, something we have to pay a lot of close attention to, which brings up the question of how do we move forward on these policies? Are there potential ways to reduce displacement when a neighborhood is greened? Are there anti-displacement programs or other things that communities are trying to reduce the likelihood of that effect? And so as we get greater evidence on that question of displacement, I'll be tracking it closely, but at this point, I'm not seeing a great deal of overwhelming evidence. Hunts Point, I mean, there's a few places like in New York that I've paid attention to where it's become an issue. My hunch, again, is that may be more rhetoric than reality. That's my hunch, but we need more evidence on that. And I mean, I'm trying to balance this as much as I can with what I'm seeing in the field with what the speculation is on this as well. Because yeah, intuitively, that argument makes a lot of sense to me, that more trees would increase property values, would then thereby displace, et cetera. But I want to really see some evidence on it.
I'm so glad that you are tracking that information. Here's another question related to the community impact. The city of Portland's past racial discriminative practices continue to greatly affect the BIPOC communities. The city has been marketing itself as an equity-centered institution, but its fundamental function as an equalizer of wealth, parentheses, trees and natural wealth in resource balance sheet, parentheses, hasn't been fulfilled. Do you know what actual practices are implemented to materially and meaningfully increase the investment allocation to correct historical wrong?
Oh boy, yeah. Erico, that is a very, very difficult question. I feel that that's out of my that's out of my league in some ways. It's a very informed question, like all the others, and it's also one of those that is tricky. I have the privilege of sitting and on a volunteer commission with the city, community resident commission, urban forestry commission. So I get little windows where I get to see how city staff and decision making is happening. I've testified and I do all the other stuff. Though that little window that I get is what I'm seeing is that there is a tremendous amount of rhetoric around this, though the institutional systems that we have in place that have been in place for a very long time will take considerable effort to reorganize and to revise to more formally center historically marginalized communities and areas. We have one thing that's really been interesting here is we have a form of government that's commissioner based, and that's each commissioner has bureaus as opposed to districts. And so what's really interesting about that is we're talking about distributional justice of trees here. And that's a question that comes up. And I've been trying to reconcile whether having a district-based approach where it's more geographically oriented rather than administratively bureau-oriented might actually move the needle a bit more on the ability to enable historically disinvested areas to be engaged in this conversation. So what materially and meaningfully increase investment allocation? I mean, the primary window, the windows through which I've seen, it's advocacy. It's how do communities get in front of commissioners? How do they testify? How do they actually make a fuss fundamentally about what is happening in a community and how and what will it take to actually improve it? That is about as far as I can go with that question. There's a lot more depth there that I imagine we could get into if we had more time.
I agree. The next question, how are you preparing for wildfires? Are you creating buffers?
Oh boy, that is the big kahuna question. I mean, the days that I imagine city staff and others just they're shaking their boots around the Forest Park fire or something like that. When we're seeing hotter summers, when we're seeing just context, when we're seeing hotter summers, we're seeing drier soils, we're seeing greater vulnerability to trees. And if that's the case, and if there are, whether it's through a vandalism or whether it's through a spark or lightning or something like that that starts a fire, the idea of an urban forest fire that we saw last summer that was getting very close to, in Clackamas County, it was getting close to large, dense human populations. That can be a game changer for a lot of the way we do this. Buffers are, of course, one way to do it. The best practices are, of course, the ensuring not only the buffers, but also the reduction of potential fuels in the area. And I know folks like, as I was mentioning, Andres Holtz and others who spend their entire careers working on these kinds of questions. And I would probably point you, John, to folks like Andres to be able to talk about these things. But I could, I could talk about it, but I don't feel like I would be the best person to respond to that particular question.
It's a slightly different question. What is your take on English ivy and trees? Recently, I recommended a landowner in Portland's West Hills to plant Douglas fir trees on his landslide below his house to stabilize it. But before planting the tree, removed all of the English ivy and continued to remove it over the time. He said that there is no correlation between ivy removal and protecting tree growth. What do you think?
Yeah, this is I mean, I follow Susan Simard's work from UBC, who talks about the allopathic and symbiotic relationship between plants. And so the extent to which this is getting into like the secret hidden life of green friends of ours, that's probably Susan's area. What I might say about this is English ivy is one of the most aggressive plants that I think we know of in the Pacific Northwest, and it definitely has a very aggressive effect, aggressive and kind of numbing and almost submissive effect on all growth, all understory growth in a forest. And so in that way, it can be incredibly harmful for the multiple layers of a healthy forest has. So we talk about the understory, we talk about the middle story, we talk about the overstory. We're really talking about the multiple complex vertical strata of a healthy forest. And if we have English ivy coming in and just taking over the entire understory, then I can pretty much imagine that's going to really prevent a healthy forest from emerging. And in order to stabilize slopes, what we really want to have is as healthy of a forest system as we can. So I would really think, yes, Doug fir, yes, get those deep roots in, though also thinking about what are other plants that could potentially fill in those spaces to further bolster and hold down the soil during those potential landslide catastrophic events that happen in the West Hills. Yeah, that's about what I got for that.
Have you looked at different perceptions of people in terms of the value of trees related to the maintenance? In other words, trees as potential hazards during windstorm or underground pipe disruptions? Yeah,
thanks, Hee-Jun. That's a very interesting question. By and large, trees are generally a forgotten part of the urban landscape. That's what people love trees, but they're often just kind of secondary to buildings and roads and sidewalks and the like. So that's one piece in terms of perceptions. In terms of values of maintenance, that is something that I know has come up a lot recently. The city created what's called a street tree maintenance task force, which was charged with essentially evaluating the extent to which we could use city money to be able to support, maintain trees in areas that communities may qualify for that kind of maintenance support. tree maintenance is very expensive, and communities don't want trees generally because of the fact that they have to maintain them. And so whether it be in Portland or whether it be in Los Angeles or whether it be in Houston, when the city has set up a law or ordinance that requires the adjacent property owner to take care of it, the folks who tend to want trees are those who have the resources to be able to steward those trees. So in terms of the maintenance piece, trees, not only from a maintenance point of view, but after the last ice storm we had in February on Valentine's Day weekend, that was very telling about an unprecedented number of trees that were down, as well as limb failures in the region, which of course costs a huge amount of money for communities. So thinking about that as a disservice has to be brought into that calculation too. Appreciate the point.
How are you getting trees into the old red zones? How are you engaging community, and what success have you seen?
Yeah, so this is the perennial question around the last point I made was around how do you co-produce landscapes together? If we're just talking about digging a hole, putting a tree and disappearing, that tree is likely not going to survive, because it really does need that care and feeding in order for it to support itself over time. And part of what we're seeing is that working with community-based organizations that are actively involved in the neighborhood discussions has been a great way to increase the likelihood of tree survivorship. We have a project right now with Friends of, it's funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and that's involving Friends of Trees and Apano, which is a local community-based or culturally specific community-based organizations that operates in East Portland primarily and Southeast Portland primarily. And what we're trying to understand is the extent to which community-based organizations can be engaged in the greening efforts more directly with nonprofits. And we're evaluating how the tree planting efforts by Friends of Trees has either alienated or further engaged or had some other effect on the community's perspective of trees. So it really is about co-producing it and trying to find ways that community-based organizations that are familiar with the space, with the community members, can participate in that conversation.
Right, thanks, Vivek. I think we covered the questions posted on the Q&A panel. So I'd like to thank Vivek for viewing the presentation and answering the question. There is another question that was posted to the EMCR program asking, how will you make sure that there are enough professional opportunities for the graduates that you will produce, and are you tracking the information about the professional opportunities? So I will hand this back to Jeremy, who already put the answer on the posting, but you might want to elaborate a little bit. All right, Jeremy, go ahead.
Thank you, Masami, and thank you, Vivek. What an engaging talk today and a wonderful discussion. I really feel the speaker series has covered a lot of different themes and tropes within the field of emergency management, and we're excited to bring you 2 more talks, the next one on June 10th and the final one in September. In order to answer that question, I really appreciate it and understand it's coming from folks' experience having trouble getting jobs in this field. What we're trying to do in our program is expose students to the jobs as early as we can and provide them with a skill-based education where they network while they're in school, so that their pathway to the jobs is a little bit shorter and that they have proper training through what the experiences that we've staged for them in school, that they can get and be competitive in those jobs. Further, and when I refer to this as an emerging field, I refer to an emerging field that's connecting community resilience to emergency management. And we're seeing positions come up in the field of nebulous that's called resilience right now, but resilience managers, public outreach specialists, folks oriented towards the human population. And as the hazards and disasters increase in frequency, as well as our knowledge related to equity, the professional sphere will open. So yes, we are tracking them, and eventually in the future, I hope to have some quantitative study on the amount of opportunities available. At this time, it's through interviewing different folks that are professionals in the field, and also looking at the changes that have occurred, especially during this time of COVID and the increase in wildfires and other climate change oriented hazards that are part of our language these days. So I want to thank everyone again for joining us today. Please join us on June 10th for our next talk. All of the talks in our series are posted on the same website that you registered for this at. We'll put that in the chat as well. Please check them out after. We'll also send you an email with a link to the video once it's ready. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you soon and at other EMCR and ICDR events. Thank you.